So here it comes to the part 6 of relative clause. Let's take a look at these two sentences. Well, basically, if you see the bridge word and it's not a question, then it should be a relative clause, right? And in these two sentences, can you find the differences? The first one is, she who runs fast is my sister. The second one is, Mary who runs fast is my sister. So in terms of meaning, they are pretty similar. But what differences can you find from these two sentences? Probably the first thing that you can realize is in the first sentence, we see the word she who runs fast is my sister. But instead, in the second sentence, you see Mary, the name in the sentence, right? And then in the second sentence, we also spot commas are used before and after the relative clause, who runs fast. But if two sentences, they have really similar meaning, why it's the structure of using this relative clause different? So when should we add commas to a relative clause? Apart from having the pronoun in first sentence and having a name in second sentence, what is the criteria for us to decide when to add commas to it? And what is the function of having commas before and after a relative clause? Before I answer all the questions that I've just said, let's take a look at this example. These two sentences are pretty similar. The first one, the shop which sells bread opens at 9 a.m. And the second one, the ABC bakery which sells delicious bread opens at 9 a.m. And you can see that they share pretty similar relative clause, which sells bread, which sells delicious bread, right? So what are the differences? And why would there be such a difference? Well, of course, immediately we can identify the commas used before and after a relative clause in the second sentence. And the next one would be the shop and the ABC bakery in the second sentence. So one is a more specific bakery. These are the immediate differences that you can find. But why would there be these differences? Now, let me ask you one more question. In terms of the purpose of having this relative clause, what is the difference between the first sentence, the first relative clause, and the second sentence, the second relative clause? So let's look at the first example one more time. Here are the two sentences. The first one, she who runs fast is my sister. The second one, Mary, comma, who runs fast, comma, is my sister. So apart from the commas, apart from the name, when do we add commas? How should we decide? Take a look. If we delete the relative clause, will you know who we are referring to? If I just say, she is my sister, do you know who I am referring to? If I say, Mary is my sister, will it be clearer? So if I already know who Mary is, and I tell you Mary is my sister, so what's the purpose of having the relative clause? Why do we still need it? And if I don't use the word Mary, if I just use she is my sister, then if I add the relative clause who runs fast, what is the purpose of adding it? Take a look at the second example one more time. The shop which sells bread opens at 9 a.m. The ABC bakery, which sells delicious bread, opens at 9 a.m. Once again, if we delete the relative clauses here in these two sentences, will you know which shop we're talking about? The first one, if I delete the relative clause, it would be the shop opens at 9. Do you know which shop I'm talking about? The bank, the bakery, the supermarket, or the pharmacy? But what if I delete the relative clause in the second sentence? The ABC bakery opens at 9. You will know that I'm talking about the ABC bakery instead of the bank or the supermarket. So what is the purpose of having the relative clause in the first sentence? And what is the purpose of having the relative clause in the second sentence? If I delete the relative clause in the first sentence, do you know which shop I'm talking about? If not, what is the purpose of having the relative clause in the first sentence? And in the second sentence, if we can delete it and we still understand which ABC bakery is, so what is the purpose of adding that relative clause to it? Think about it. Actually, in the first relative clause in the first sentence, she who runs fast is my sister, this relative clause cannot be deleted. Because one is deleted, then we won't know who she is. So the relative clause here is to define who this person is. And that's why we also call it defining relative clause. It cannot be deleted. But in the second sentence, because we already have the name of the person, Mary, and so this relative clause is not to define who this person is. If I delete the second relative clause in the second sentence, actually, it's totally fine. I will still know Mary is my sister. So the purpose of having the relative clause in the second sentence is not to define, but is to give extra information about this person. Therefore, this relative clause is actually called non-defining relative clause because it is not used to define this person. So, in this example, the shop which sells bread opens at 9. And I cannot delete the relative clause in this sentence because if I delete it, I wouldn't know which shop I'm talking about. So, this relative clause is to define which shop this is. So, it can also be called defining relative clause. And the second sentence, the second relative clause, the ABC Bakery. Well, you've already known that we're talking about the ABC Bakery. So, this relative clause is not to define which bakery we're talking about. It is just to give extra information about this bakery, which sells delicious bread. Okay? And it opens at 9. So, this relative clause is a non-defining relative clause. It's not to define the bakery, but to give extra information about it. Therefore, to sum up, all relative clauses can be divided into defining relative clause or non-defining relative clause. And for defining relative clause is to define the subject or object, noun, that you are talking about. The word just before the WH word, just before the relative clause, is to define the noun. And for non-defining relative clause is not to define the noun, but to give extra information to the subject or object noun. So let's take a look at this last example. The boy who was fat hurt himself. Because we don't know which boy we're talking about, but the one who was fat. So this is a defining relative clause without comma. Okay? But then in the second sentence, Tom hurt himself. This one is fine. So who was fat, this relative clause, is just to give extra information about Tom. And so it's a non-defining relative clause. And to put a non-defining relative clause, after the noun that we want to describe, we will put commas before and after the relative clause, if the relative clause is in the middle of the sentence. And of course, if we want to identify which noun, subject, or object that we need to use non-defining relative clause, then you just need to think whether this noun is known. Okay? Do you understand who or what thing you are talking about and referring to? If you know, okay? If you know, then you can use non-defining relative clause. But if the noun is unknown, if you don't use the relative clause, you wouldn't know who or what thing you're talking about, then you need a defining relative clause. The easiest way to use non-defining relative clause is on names, like people's name, brand names, or places. So things that are known and can be identified, then you use non-defining relative clause. But sometimes it may not be a proper name. It may not be a person's name. It may not be a brand name. It may not be a known place. It can simply be a noun, but then you know what this noun is referring to. Then we can still use non-defining relative clause. Like my mother. If you know me, probably you know my mother too. So even my mother is not a proper noun, it's not a name, you will still know who I'm talking about. Then for a situation like this, you will use non-defining relative clause. So you really need to design and judge based on the context, whether you know this person, whether you know this thing, to decide to use defining relative clause or non-defining relative clause. But if the relative clause is at the end of the sentence, then we don't need two commas. We just need to put a comma right before the WH word, and then we just put a full stop at the end. Okay? So in these two sentences, you can see the difference. If my relative clause is at the end of the sentence, we just need one comma and then the full stop at the end. But if the relative clause is put in between the sentence, then we will need 2 commas in between, like in the second sentence. Tom, comma, who sings well, comma, is my friend. So that's the end of this video. I hope that after watching this video, you will be able to identify defining relative clause and non-defining relative clause, and you can judge when you should use defining or non-defining relative clause. Thanks for watching.